Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our hosts an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
Okay, well, we are really lucky today to be joined by two folks who are experts in the art of making decisions. They are Dan Levy and Richard Zeckhauser. And let me give a bit of an intro. But before I do, I got to do one quick shout out to the person who helped put this interview together. Shout out to Diego. Diego is a finance student at Toronto Metropolitan University up here north of the border. Diego read your book, Dan, and absolutely loved it. And Diego was also a summer student at CSI last year. Diego sent me a copy of the book and said, you need to get Dan and Richard on the podcast. So I read the book, absolutely loved the book. The book is fantastic. And thank you to Diego for putting this or helping put this interview together. So again, you've got students up here north of the border, guys. It's not just Harvard. You've got some pretty prominent Canadian universities who are also reading your book, and the students are getting through it. So again, it's not just a Harvard issue. It's also making its way north of the border as well. So yeah,
Glad to hear that. Thank you.
So I'm going to give a little bit of background on both Dan and Richard. So let me start with Dan Levy first. Dan teaches quantitative methods, policy analysis, and program evolution at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's been doing that for over 15 years. Dan has won several teaching awards, including the university-wide David Pickett Award for teaching and mentoring. And as I had mentioned, Dan is also the author of the terrific book, Maxims for Thinking Analytically. And I think I would highly recommend that people take a read of the book. It's really not just for folks who are making decisions inside of corporations, but there's actually a lot of discussion in there about making decisions in your personal life, including, a lot of health related decisions. Actually, I was surprised to see the number of health related discussions in the book and making decisions based on advice you're getting from healthcare professionals. Then I'm going to flip it over to Richard here. So a little bit of background on Richard. Richard is a professor at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government as well, specializing in economics, finance, decision theory, and game theory. Richard has either been the author or co-author of over 235 articles and approximately 10 books. Richard, I just learned he loves to play tennis. Both Richard and Dan love to play tennis. I just learned about a couple of minutes ago. But Richard is also a championship bridge player, and he has also been a principal in 2 investment banking firms and a director on a number of technology companies as well. And Richard, I was doing some sleuthing on your Wikipedia page, and I don't know if this is factually correct or not, but it does state on your Wikipedia page that you were one of the whiz kids assembled by Defense Secretary Robert S. McNamara to apply cutting-edge analysis to Cold War military strategy way back when. Now, one of my favorite authors actually is Annie Jacobson. She's a New York Times bestselling author, and her most recent book was on, what would happen in the event of nuclear war. And, frankly, I don't think there was any outcome that was positive. Everything pretty much ended in misery. And I'm betting now, as I read that quote from your Wikipedia page, I would bet that some of your studies, which it sounded like were all confidential and pretty top secret, were probably referenced in Annie's book, but in any event, pretty cool background. So what I thought we would do first, guys, is have a little bit of fun, because again, we obviously make decisions on a regular basis, and there's complicated decisions and maybe non-complicated decisions. And what I wanted to do is apply the concept of decision making to a real world problem, and that is how to select dinner at a restaurant. And I'm just wondering, when you guys go out for dinner, let's say you guys come up to Toronto, and if you guys do come up to Toronto, I'd love to take you out for dinner. But let's assume you guys do come up for Toronto and you guys are experts in decision making, obviously. So let's assume I select a restaurant and I hand you a menu. And now you've got a menu choice where again, you've never been to this restaurant before and you've got a list of, 20 different items on a menu. Maybe walk me through the decision process for selecting a meal. And is this going to be the longest dinner that I've ever had in my lifetime? So maybe Dan, I'll start with you. Take us through, you go to a brand new restaurant, how do you apply the concepts in your book at all, or if you even do, to selecting a meal for at a particular restaurant?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you, Scott, for inviting us to your podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. It's interesting you started with that question because I think, as almost every student of Richard will tell you, he applies his analytic tools and frameworks to all sorts of issues, but especially about eating in restaurants. So I hope that he's not only going to give you some thoughts about how he chooses the items from the menu, which I'll try to do some of that as well, but also he can analyze the pricing strategy of different restaurants in ways that I think are very enlightening. So I hope you will follow up with that. So let me just to be super concrete of some of the things that I've learned from Richard, which I reflected in the book. As you know, the book is called Maxims for Thinking Analytically. Maxims are this one sentence nuggets of wisdom from Richard that you can often sort of call on to in your everyday life to make better decisions. So one that I think is very important as you choose your meal. If Richard and I were going to have a meal together and we were willing to share food, I think I would try to look for ways in which he and I wouldn't be ordering the same dish. So we can at least benefit from the complementarities that come from, okay, maybe I like this dish, but maybe I like this other one as well. A second, so the maxim number 16 in the book is capitalize on complementarities, which I think is, to me, one of the most important maxims of the book, which is how do you make choices? How do you choose people to work with? How do you choose people you hire? We tend to hire people who are very similar to us. And so I think the book goes through a little bit of that. One of the main topics of the book is the idea that because decisions are made under conditions of uncertainty, we sometimes make decisions that end up having bad outcomes. So maxim number 8 says good decisions sometimes have poor outcomes. So you might look at the menu of the restaurant. You might make an informed choice, perhaps by asking the waiter or waitress some questions that would help you make that choice. But you might end up unlucky and not have a good meal. And it's very easy to blame yourself. Oh my God, I should have ordered this other dish. But in reality, if you made a decision that was as well informed as you can once you're at the restaurant, maybe you shouldn't feel so bad. Restaurants are places where you can get to go more than once. So there's none of decisions that, once you made them, you can't revert them. So those are, I think, things that would be valuable. Let me add just 2 quick things. Maxim number 12 of the book, information is only valuable if it can change your decision. So I don't tend to ask the waiter or waitress for information that won't change what dish I'm going to order. It doesn't matter if they say A or B. And then the last thing I would say, I don't know that this is explicit in the book, but I think I certainly learned this from Richard, is I never ask the waiter or waitress, what do you recommend? Because that I think puts them in the frame of mind of trying to do what's best for the restaurant and not what's best for you. And so I think a question that yields more information is, of these dishes, which one you sell the most? I
Interesting.
mean, they can lie and still do the thing that's best for the restaurant. But I think you're more likely to get something. Now, you might not like the dish that's most popular, but at least that gives you a little bit more information than what dish do you recommend.
And
All
what
right. I'm
about
sure Richard has many things to add, but sorry, go
it's
ahead.
interesting. Now, Dan, you brought up a bunch of things that frankly I've never thought about before when doing that. What about when they recommend the special or when they outline the special? Would you typically lean towards going with the special for the day, or would you also steer away from the special?
I mean, my own view on these things is that the restaurant has objectives that are not completely aligned with yours, and so you have to think about. I mean, obviously they want to keep you happy, but if they have a fish that will go rotten tomorrow, they'll have incentives to try to sell that fish today.
Got it.
And also, you know, the taste of the taste preferences of the particular waiter that you happen to have might not be the same as yours. So there's less information there than if you just sort of say which one you sell the most. You might still don't like the popular dish, but at least you gain more information.
Got it. Richard, are you on side with that? Is that a good outline
Well,
of how you
first
would go through the process?
okay. Well, the first point I should make is um, Dan and I love to do analysis. That's what we're paid to do. But you shouldn't do too much analysis if the issue isn't important.
Got it.
Okay. So spend a lot more time deciding on what your retirement portfolio should be than what you should at a restaurant. And I'd like to tell you a story about one of the people I've admired the most in my life, a man named Howard Raiffa, father of decision analysis and negotiation theory, RAIFFA. And we taught together when I began my career. And we were talking about compound interest and the like, and he decided to use, how much money you'll have on retirement if you start when you're 30 years old. And so I asked him in class, I said, I think I called him Professor Rafe at that point. How did you make your retirement decision? As academics in the United States, you get to choose between a stock portfolio and a bond portfolio, TIA ref. And he said, well, I went to the office in our main administrative building, and I asked the lady there, what should I do? And she said, oh, Professor Rafa, I can't tell you that. And then he said, well, what do most people do? And well, most people do 50-50. He said, okay, that's what I'll do. Now, at this point, I was, 28 and he was 40. And he said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I'm 100% in craft. And then he asked why, and eventually he switched. And of course, he ended up doing much better. Warren Buffett says he should be 90-10. But here it was, a father of decision theory, making the most important financial decision in his life on what do most people do. I do think it's important to worry about how to make decisions in a restaurant, not so much because I really care whether you get the sole or the steak, but because it's a terrific area to practice your decision making. I know one of the questions that you're going to ask us later on is, how do you learn to think on probabilistic items? And I think the way is to guess a lot of unimportant items. What's the likelihood that the next car comes by is going to be green? What's the likelihood that Dan will be on time for our lunch? And you get good at, learning how to do that. Now, I think that that's true when you think about how you should deal with the restaurant. One of the worst things to do at a restaurant, and Dan sort of spoke against this, is there we are in Toronto. You sort of say, oh, I'm taking you to this wonderful restaurant. I've never been there. And then I said, well, what are you having? He said, I'm going to have the sole française. I said, oh, well, then I'll have the sole française. Now, that happens when we go out to dinner with another couple. That happens 20% of the time. Somebody just picks the same item, even though there's no information. Another principle, it's not one of our maxims, but it's one of the principles that Dan and I follow, which is glean information whenever you can. So I'm going to present a restaurant decision. You're going to a restaurant and they have two dishes that intrigue you. One, it's, you look over at the next table and there's, you can even smell the succulent steak. Looks awfully good. And then they have a dish that you've had once in your life and you loved it. truffle risotto. A truffle risotto is a pretty fancy dish, and you really don't know, how well they're going to make it. And you look down the menu and you discover that they have frog's legs on the menu. Frog's legs disgust you. You'd never think of having them. But given that they have frog's legs, that tells you this is a pretty sophisticated restaurant. And that could tip you towards the truffle risotto as opposed to the steak. Just for saying you're getting information on something that you're not interested in at all, but it helped you. Another important principle, which is one of our is generate new alternatives. One of the things that I do not infrequently when I go to a nice restaurant is I look and I sort of say, oh, well, the fish dish has accompaniments that I really like. It has, these broccolinis and these potatoes, and the other dish that I was considering, which was the chicken dish, has different ones. So you just ask them, could I get what you have accompanying the chicken dish on the fish dish? 70% of the time they'll sort of say yes, or yes, we can do that for the potatoes, but not for the vegetable because it's stirred in with the dish. But it's a very easy thing to do. I did that last night with my wife. We went to a restaurant and they had mussels with white wine or marinara sauce. And she wanted the white wine, but they also had mussels elsewhere on the menu with pasta, but only pasta with marinara. I said, could we get the mussels with white wine and pasta? And they said, sure. It wasn't very expensive, and it wasn't expensive for them, but it was easy to do. By the way, I love to, I rarely, but love to disagree with Dan. I do think it's worthwhile to get the special. I don't know this, but I think the special, particularly if you're getting something like fish, is always fresh. And it's probably gotten more attention from the head chef than from the line chef. So I would be more inclined to get the special than he would. One thing that I don't like about the special is they never tell you the price. And everyone is too scared to ask for the price of the special. So sometimes you discover things on the dish are, 50 Canadian, the regular items in the menu, and the special is 60 Canadian. You never would have paid it. But if I had a little more courage, I would do better in that situation. I just want to make one final point about not doing too much analysis. It involves another one of the professors that I've had who I admire greatly. His name was John Lintner, and he's one of the fathers of modern portfolio theory. He hasn't been with us probably for 30 years, Lintner. And he asked me when I was an assistant professor how I decided to buy a new car. I said, well, I looked in Consumer Report. I said, we don't have much money, so I looked at their compact cars, and we were two people. I looked for the one that they rated the highest, and then I went out and bought it. And he said, oh, I'm disappointed in you. I said, well, Professor Lindner, how do you do it? He says, well, I do careful analysis. I looked for used cars that are 3 years old, which is before they're starting to break down, and they still are in good shape. And I get 3 of them, and I take them to my mechanic and ask them which one he likes. And then I go and I buy it.
That's good.
I said, Professor Lindner, I'm disappointed in you. He said, why? I said, well, you're a fancy Harvard Business School professor. You're earning at that point probably $100,000 a year. You go off and spend a day of your life, which you could sell to Wall Street for, $10,000 to figure out what is your new car. Now, I now realize with retrospect of 50 years that John Lintner enjoyed doing that and telling people that he enjoyed doing it. But it wouldn't make sense for me, and I don't think it would make sense for you. So a big principle, which didn't get into our book, is do more analysis when the analysis is either cheap or it's going to be very valuable. But don't do a lot of analysis on an unimportant subject.
No, that's great advice. That's great advice.
And by the way, if we have a few of these principles, Dan is so efficient, he'll be having a new book in another year, Principles for Thinking Analytically.
So I wanted to then follow up, Richard, on one of the points you had made is that when you had talked about the professor who was selecting his how he was going to allocate his retirement fund, and I wanted to make perhaps a broader point on this is that there you have an example of a Harvard professor who specializes in decision making, and he's making one of the most important decisions of his life based on advice that he's getting from the office person, effectively. Whereas when he would go and teach, presumably he would be telling everybody to do the opposite of that. Exactly. In your own experience, do you think people are actually good at making decisions, or are people poor at making decisions based on your experience?
My feeling is that people are good at making decisions in their areas of expertise, or their areas of enthusiastic observation, and bad in other areas, and they don't know what to do, or they feel very hesitant to make their own decisions in other areas, and they don't do a good job of figuring out how to make the decision. Let me give you what I consider to be the most salient example of that. If you hang around Harvard, you'll meet a lot of affluent people. A number of them have substantial investment portfolios. Most of those people pay somebody 0.75% or 1% a year of their investment portfolio to manage it. That's an enormous amount. Otherwise, if your stocks are going up at 8% a year, you're giving up 12% of your return.
Mm-hmm.
Then you ask them, how much does your portfolio turn over? Well, they said, well, these stocks, which I inherited from my mother, I'm never going to sell.
Yeah,
So why am I paying Joe or Susie 1% a year to oversee the stocks that I'm never going to sell? And I tell these people, I said, well, first as you can read, about Warren Buffett, who tells you just to buy index funds. So you don't have to pay very much. You can now pay, 1/10 of 1%, or many companies now charge 0%. Or you can give the guy 20% of your portfolio where you need to make trades and you don't want to do it yourself, and keep the other portfolio just in a, Fidelity account. And that's the advice that I give to lots of people. By the way, I should observe, it's not clear that it's good advice, but I give financial advice to a significant number of people who don't want to pay somebody else 1% a year. And what they usually do is they take me out for a pizza once a year.
Hopefully it's a good pizza. Dan, are you in the same boat? Where do you do you generally think people are good at making decisions, and where do you think they're the pitfalls lie? Are you with Richard, or do you think maybe are people maybe better at making decisions than you give them credit for?
I think there's a lot of research suggesting that people make decisions that are suboptimal for the outcomes that they value. The whole field of behavioral science, behavioral economics has plenty of examples demonstrating that. I think one thing that I learned from Richard, which I think has been certainly applying to me, is that I think a lot of behavioral scientists look at the world and sort of say, all right, it's just hopeless to get people to make better decisions. We just have to design better environments for those decisions to be more of the default, or decisions that are easier to make. And I feel like since knowing some of the principles that Richard advances, I've become a better decision maker. I mean, one that he mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, I used to spend a lot of time on decisions that had little consequence. And now every time that I catch myself doing that, I'm like, all right, let's not let me make, I mean, I'm far from an optimal decision maker. I still take way too long for decisions that are not as important. But in some way, part of the power of the maxims that we put in the book is kind of a quick reminders that might steer you in the right direction when you get stuck. Some of them might seem like they're not um, that earth shattering, but we forget to do them very often. So, don't be limited by the options you have in front of you. Maxim 11, which Richard just illustrated with, okay, if the restaurant has two dishes and you kind of want a combination, why are you not going to at least create that third option? Um, I was literally walking with a student yesterday. She was saying, undecided whether to take this job or this other job, and it was very clear to me that neither of those two jobs were jobs that she was excited by. And I mean, to me, that maxim came clearly to my mind, and I said, it's fine, these options, you have them, but why don't you try to generate another option that you like more? So overall, I think most people could improve their decision making. And I think there are ways of practicing. I think the reason we spend so much time on the restaurant question is not, as Richard said, because the choice of the dish is going to be that important. If you don't have a good meal, you don't come back to that restaurant, or you come back the next day and order a different dish. So it really makes no big difference. But because by practicing the skill of decision making, you're going to be better off in both small and larger decisions.
So then let's flip over then to corporations and governments, and maybe Richard, I'll throw corporations to you, and then Dan, I'll flip governments over to you after Richard comments. But Richard, maybe just comment a little bit about, we've talked a lot so far about making personal decisions. Your thoughts about corporations and their ability to make decisions. Have you seen, what have you kind of seen over time? You've obviously been involved as a director on some technology companies, so you would have seen front lines, people making decisions. Generally speaking, do you think corporations are making good decisions, or do you think, again, this is another area where there's substantial room for improvement?
Well, I think corporations have a big advantage over governments and universities, which is where I see the most decisions, and indeed many families, which is they have a fairly unified objective function. And even in the family, it might be that you want to do one thing and your wife wants to do something else. There's, Dan and I are academics. One of the things that you see with academics is he and I are sort of stick in the mud, but many people move around from one university to another. And they sometimes have the principle, okay, this time we'll move for you because I got a good position at the University of Toronto, but next time I'll move, you'll move for me. And that doesn't make sense. I mean, otherwise it might be that we should agree ex ante with, my wife and myself, that if one of us gains 10 and one of us, gains 6, the gaining 10 is more important than the gaining 6.
Yeah.
And that we should do that. But with a corporation, at least you say that our objective is to maximize the long-term value of the corporation, which may lead to a short-term notion of, maximizing profits this year. But I presume that in your company, which is a pretty forward-looking company, sometimes they sort of say, no, we'll be happy to sacrifice profits this year to secure more profits, going into the future. But then you and I have the same interest. It's just we might disagree as to what we're going to get out of an R&D effort, for example. So I think that that's a very big advantage that corporations have. I think corporations have somewhat of a disadvantage that people within the corporation are always worried about, how this is going to affect me. So there are things that we call agency problems, and I might not take the best decision for the corporation because if it does work out well, I'm going to get promoted. Or I might be too risk averse because if something comes out poorly, I'm going to get blamed even if I made a good decision with a bad outcome. And one of the things that you want to do as a corporate executive is tell the people below you, we're going to judge you by your decisions and not just by their outcomes, or even not primarily by their outcomes. So, corporations have advantages and disadvantages. And I think the important thing is not, do we give them a grade of 87, but is there a way to move their grade of, if it is 87, up to 92? And I just gave you one suggestion on how that might be done.
And Dan, so maybe comment on governments. We live in a world right now where there's a lot of decisions being made by the U.S. government, and we're hopefully going to have a bit of a discussion on tariffs, because I'd love to get your perspective on some of the, some of the key considerations on how to, critical decisions on tariffs, which have an impact across so many different, so many different people, so many different countries, and things like that, and how people actually think about that. Because I think all of your principles come together when looking at an issue as complicated as tariffs. But maybe as a more generic point, Dan, your thoughts just on government's ability to make decisions and how that differs a little bit from corporations.
Yeah, I think, governments can make good decisions. They don't always do. And I think Richard pointed out to one of the main reasons. Governments frequently have different objectives. That is, different criteria by which you can judge their decision making. So maybe as an outsider, you might judge, okay, they made the wrong decision, but it could be that it's not that they made the wrong decision, it's that they weighted the different criteria different than you would have weighted it. And governments, obviously, political feasibility is an important criteria. Whether what you're planning to do is legal or not is an important criteria. There are lots of things that you're trying to take into account to decide among options, and they tend to be more complicated than other decisions, like certainly than personal decisions, but even than decisions of corporations. In the book, we have this maxim, 10 errors of commission should be weighted the same as errors of omission. And I think Richard has an interesting example, which we often use when we do like classes or workshops on the book. The example that we use is, during COVID, as it was clear that the vaccines were sort of going to work, governments around the world took a long time to go from being able to sort of say, all right, vaccines are ready, let's just go and give vaccines as quickly as possible, to actually giving the vaccines. And one of the potential reasons for that might be that they were fearing that if there were any side effects or anything like that could generate bad outcomes for a very small number of people, the governments were going to be blamed for this error of commission. We injected something into your body and then some bad outcome happened. But what I think most people fail to see is that, by delaying for a month or 2 or 3 months the beginning of the vaccine campaigns, there are lots of people who might have died because they didn't get the vaccine. But those are not directly attributable to the government in the same way. Those are an error of omission. And why I completely agree with the analytic principle, I think when we teach these workshops, people resist them. And I think part of what they resist them is if you're a government official, you might see the logic of, no, even if a small number of people have bad outcomes, on average, we're going to have much, much better outcomes if we sort of roll out the vaccines right now. Yet, if you are the Minister of Health or the Secretary of Health or whoever is the authority, you do worry how these errors of a commission are going to affect you. So that is one of the, I mean, it's not that it happens in government only, it happens both in corporations and personal decision making. But I think it's so much more daily in the public sector. The public rarely is forgiving of errors of commission where it's very clear what you have done. So that I think makes just things harder. And again, just like Richard, it's not about a scorecard. It's about, okay, how can we get them to do things better? And hopefully some of the principles in the book are good for that.
Can I respond to that, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Richard. Yeah.
So first, I think you want to ask the question, do governments make good decisions? You should ask, do they make good decisions for the objectives that the current administration has? So I think that if you look at the Biden and Trump administrations, if you ask Donald Trump how he felt about the Biden decisions, assuming that he was being scrupulously honest, he would say, I think they were terrible. He was doing all these things that I thought was terrible. He was letting people in through the border. He was supporting DEI. He was bolstering Medicaid. Those were all awful. If you ask Joe Biden, what do you think about what the Trump administration, he said, I think that most of the important decisions that he's made that are different from mine are all terrible. He's doing these things. He's having, chaos with regard to his tariffs. He's trying to cut Medicaid. He's going after the R&D establishment of the United States, which I was trying to support. Now, that could be true. And as a citizen, you may like neither of them, but if you like the Biden one, you don't like the Trump one. If you like the Trump one, you didn't like the Biden one. And then there's the other notion, which is that the government is frequently tugged in different directions by its own constituencies. I gather you're going to ask us about tariffs later. Elon Musk, probably, for a long time, the second most important person in the administration, said, I want zero tariffs between the United States and Europe. That was not, Donald Trump's approach to the situation. So I think that you have to, one is the government's, are the government's objectives, at least as defined by the heads of the government, appropriate? And the answer is, for me, sometimes, and sometimes very much no. And then the second one is the government unified in what it decides to do? And as you're no doubt aware, there's now a debate in the United States as to which organizations get to make the decisions. We used to think that we had a balance of powers. And Congress approves this, and the Supreme Court approves that, and the executive branch does that. And President Trump says, well, that's not the way it's going to work. And there's going to be, a significant tussle as to, how that's in fact turns out.
So let's just take the tariffs, and let's go into some of the maxims. Like, in terms of making a decision on tariffs, how would you apply this concept of using extreme cases when dealing with the complex issue? Like, I would assume at Harvard, this is an issue where you guys have done case studies on, or perhaps will be doing case studies on, because there's just so many things that you can dig into. But if we apply the maxim of again, trying to leverage extreme cases, how would you apply that in the situation of tariffs when trying to figure out, should it be, if we're looking at Canada and their steel, should it be 5% or should it be 20% or should it be 0?
Dan?
I think Rich is going to have more to say about this and, well, about all the topics, but especially on this one, than I will. I think it's fair to say that most economists, as a matter of principle, don't think tariffs are a very effective tool to promote any of the government's objectives. So both Richard and I are economists, and I suspect we both hold that view in principle. Having said that, couple of things to keep in mind. I think it's very clear that even if you wanted to use tariffs to achieve whatever objective you were trying to achieve, say protecting, um, you mentioned steel, so protecting steel workers. Um, if that, protecting the local employment in the local industry. If you look at the case of the US, the number of people working in the steel industry versus the number of people working in industries that use steel, the second number is 50 sometimes the first number. So
Yeah.
if you were using tariffs to protect the local industry, you were going to protect a very small number of people, those who work in the steel industry, and you're going to end up hurting by the increase in the steel price, um, a number of people that's just 50 times greater than the people you're trying to protect. So my sense is that even if you were willing to sort of say tariffs can achieve a goal, it doesn't seem to me that it was done in a way that advances those interests. Now, a theme in the book, certainly in Richard's thinking, that maybe didn't appear directly as a subject of the book, but certainly in a lot of the thinking behind the book, is you always have to think about, okay, what is the other party going to do, and put yourself in their shoes. I think some people might see some of what the Trump administration has done with tariffs as an attempt at setting some negotiation in more favorable terms. I think it's possible that that's true. It certainly seems like in the style of President Trump. But the uncertainty that has been created in the markets and more generally, I think has not been overall good. So, as Richard said, we might sort of agree or disagree on what are the objectives that are being pursued, but even if you took the objectives that are being pursued, you want to think about, okay, is this an effective way of achieving this objective?
Okay, let me say a little bit about this. First, I would just observe, I don't want to, just have recourse to authority, but I believe that there's no highly respected economist, outside of the government and, ideological think tanks, who's a major supporter of, dramatic tariffs. I mean, otherwise nobody stepped forward. Nobody said, "Oh, we're going to go to this professor at the, University of British Columbia or the University of Washington, who, to get, his or her view as to why tariffs are terrific." So objectively, I think that what we've been playing with at extreme level makes no sense. I think the next question is the one that we've discussed previously, which was, how well do tariffs satisfy President Trump's objectives? And I'd say a couple of things about that. One, I don't believe that President Trump knows what his objective was. He had a mixture of things that he might have accomplished, and he figured, as his wont, I'll throw it out there and I will see what happened. There's no evidence that he consulted widely before he came up with this policy. Now, he's proposed this in the past, so maybe he doesn't need to consult widely. And I've mentioned a couple of professors that I respected enormously. Would it be okay if I name dropped the next felon?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, well, when he was a graduate student, there's a man named Peter Navarro, who's Trump's principal tariff advisor. I was friendly with Peter. He was a very nice, very down the middle graduate student. He went off to an excellent job at the University of Santa Barbara. And, I didn't hear of him again for many years. And then he wrote a book which was, China is the big bad wolf. And then Trump retracted him, and then he became a tariff hawk. And now he's Trump's, tariff right-hand man, always pushing for more tariffs. But I think that the current Peter Navarro is unfortunate for himself and for the country. I mean, going to jail is not much fun for refusing to participate with a variety of investigations. But I think that he may be one of the few people in government who's a big enthusiast. Certainly, Lutnick, who's our Secretary of Commerce, and Bessent, who's our Secretary of Treasury, they occasionally will say a nice word about tariffs, but they weren't supporters in the past, and I don't think they're really supporters of the present. I think there are three possible reasons that Trump tried tariffs. One, he at least announced that he thought he would get a lot of money. Nobody thinks that's the case. If you have tariffs that are over 100%, basically people will stop trading. But it goes along with the notion of, I don't want to get money from taxes. I want to have tax cuts. So to be, quote, fiscally responsible, which some Republicans insist on, I'm going to have to get money from tariffs, so I'm going to pretend I'm going to get a lot of money from tariffs. The second one is he thought he would get better deals. He certainly thinks of himself as the world's best deal maker. And to some extent, he has gotten better deals. I mean, getting China to agree at least tentatively to 10% tariffs on our goods and 30% on theirs is, a reasonably good outcome. When he writes his memoir, that will get a chapter. And then I think a third thing, which is really important, is he wants to appear smart. And he's very good at claiming victories when many of the people who will be on this Zoom call will not think that he's achieved a victory. I think one of the things that he didn't think about is how much this chaos would cost. And it certainly has, because a lot of companies, haven't invested or have made efforts to, get new supply arrangements, which wouldn't be desirable if tariffs went here and nobody knows where they're going to go. So, and it's clear that when he made his deal with the UK and when he made his deal with China, financial markets responded quite favorably, implying that people think that the economy is going to be better. So I hope and pray that we're going to get back to levels of what you might call reasonable tariffs. So I would think that the reasonable tariffs we're going to get will be, from my standpoint, less desirable than the very few tariffs that we had in the future, or the very low tariffs we've had in the past. By the way, I should also tell you, since you have a significant Canadian audience, as much as I love going to Canada, I went to Toronto last summer to play in the British Nationals. I very much hope that I'm still going to need to show my passport or driver's license when I go to Canada, because you're a foreign country.
Yeah, it's there's if in terms of the tariffs, if you look at some of those maxims, like let's say President Trump came to the both of you and said, "Look, I'm thinking about introducing tariffs, to these different countries," and you go back to those maxims and say, "Okay, how do I leverage an extreme case in order to provide some good advice on tariffs?" Like, how would you, when it comes to tariffs, how would you go about doing that?
Well, I would say two things. One is I would sort of tell him, and this is Maxim 5, the world is much more uncertain than you think.
Yeah.
And when you do this, things are going to work out poorly, and might work out poorly because you don't know what's going to happen. We've never seen the United States, the major economy in the world, take these major measures. And for example, you might see the dollar get threatened, which he didn't think about. And when it did get threatened, that's when he started to pull back. So I would have him do that. And then I'd sort of say, how will you feel if the dollar pulls back by 2%. How will you feel if people start talking? We've been benefiting for decades from the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. How will you feel when you discover that Canadians seem to be a little bit more eager to hold euros and a little less eager to hold American dollars? And Europeans are much more eager to hold euros than American dollars. And tourists aren't coming to the United States. Our tourists from Canada are down over 50%.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
And, I give a lot of credit to trying to make you our 51st state, but I give a lot of credit to, our, significant tariffs imposed on Canada. So I would make him think about those issues and tell him you just don't know what's going to come.
And perhaps a better approach would have been to dip your toe in the water on some, like, and it goes back to this timeline. And Richard, you alluded to this earlier, right? Like, you have a corporation where the CEO might be in place for 20 years. Like, you referenced Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett's been running Berkshire for what? He's in his 90s. He's probably been running it for 70 years. It started in his 20s. He's going to make a decision, especially in his younger days, where he knows that he's going to have to, deal with the consequences of that decision potentially 15 years down the road. This is a 4-year clock that we're dealing with here in the United States. Do you think that, like, how does that come into play in terms of the decision making, trying to figure out, how things are actually going to play out in the very short term?
Well, I think that's all that Trump thought about it. I think he thinks he really has 2 years because
Yeah.
he's, reasonable chance he's going to lose one of the houses in the midterms, and he's not going to do that. Indeed, I think he has less than 2 years because Republicans, members of Congress who are at some risk of not getting reelected when the election starts to loom, as they will, at the end of this year, they're going to be much less willing to vote for his policies. So I think he has a very short, time cloud. But he's, the term shock and awe, which has been used before in the U.S. government, I think that's Trump's approach to life.
Now maybe Dan, I'll ask you, Richard. You talked about uncertainties, and that being one of the big issues with respect to tariffs. Is that, frankly, if you're going to go shock and awe, the impact of tariffs could have a very significant impact on a world that is very difficult to predict. Is there a way to address that uncertainty through using some of the maxims in the book? The big one, obviously, trying to deal with the fact that the world isn't predictable. How would you go at trying to estimate, perhaps some of the potential outcomes of these tariffs, some which you could maybe be able to see in advance, and some which, again, is just it kind of just happened without being able to predict it?
And I think the it's not just the implementation. It's not just the tariffs as a policy, but the way that the tariffs were implemented created more uncertainty in the world than they should have. So if you had from the beginning said, here's what we're going to do, and sort of be very clear, but as we saw, the tariffs were being suspended while people were still defending, in the administration were still defending the tariffs. So I think that kind of chaos generates uncertainty. And I think, again, I'm not suggesting that the tariffs were a good policy to begin with, but I think an implementation that would have been clearer and a lot more sort of less likely to have people saying what is going to happen tomorrow would have helped. I do think that the fact that the tariffs were so extreme also generated uncertainty. If they had gone from like 10 to 20 or something like that, maybe people would have said, all right, we know that this is where we're going. And I think when they're that extreme, my sense is that people were saying this is either going to lead to a huge trade war and the world is going to fall apart, or something else is going to happen. But if you are a corporation or a business person trying to decide, what do I do now? This was a very, very chaotic, or maybe still is a very chaotic period, given the way that the tariff policy was implemented.
I also
Absolutely.
think that we would have gotten more sensible policies, and the policies would have had more legitimacy if President Trump had implemented them in a different way. If he had said, when he was first appointed, as I promised America, we're going to have tariffs to establish a fairer trading system where our allies don't take advantage of us. So I am setting up a short-term commission. It will be headed by my Secretary of the Treasury. It will have 3 corporate executives. It will have 2 labor leaders, a senator, a congressman, and somebody else, and they will, provide counsel on how we should implement this proposal. Now, the problem with that policy is, I think President Trump wanted to sort of say, here's my policy, and I'm the smartest man in the world, and here are what the tariffs are going to be. But I presume that if he had done that, even if he had taken his favorite congressman, his favorite senator, his favorite cabinet officers, 3 favorite corporate executives, he still would have gotten more reasonable policies and more legitimacy when he did that. And it wouldn't have taken very much time, but that wasn't his approach.
All right, well, let's switch gears a little bit to a topic that's a little bit more fun. One of my favorite chapters in the book is good decisions with bad outcomes. Because I think, especially as a sports fan, I think this is very, very, very prevalent, and again, I think people can have some serious bias issues when you make a good decision and there's a bad outcome. You assume that it was a bad decision, but in a lot of cases, it was actually a good decision. And what I'm going to reference is an event which I'm guessing both of you guys would remember very well. And I'm going to go back to Super Bowl 49. It's still talked about today. For those that don't know, this was the New England Patriots versus Seattle Seahawks. Close game, closing seconds. Seattle has the ball. It's 2nd and goal in the Pats 1 yard line. The coach of the Seattle Seahawks decides to pass the ball instead of handing off to all-star running back Marshawn Lynch. Again, if you're a football fan, you'll remember this event quite well because, again, it has been replays over and over again, and these coaches and the players are still asked about it on a regular basis. How does this actually play out? Is the pass is intercepted by the New England Patriots, and it's game over. Pete Carroll, the coach of the Seattle Seahawks, is ridiculed even to this day of saying that was a poor decision, and in some reports it would say perhaps the worst decision made in NFL history, not to have handed off the ball to Marshawn Lynch. I had always thought that it was actually a good decision because they attempted to catch the Patriots off guard, and it was just poorly executed. Perhaps the quarterback should have thrown that ball away unless the receiver was wide open, which obviously he wasn't. Maybe that's what should have happened. But I'm not the decision expert. And maybe I'll throw this question out. I don't know who the bigger football fan is, whether that's Dan or Richard. But are you guys in agreement that this is a really good example of a good decision with a bad outcome? Or are you perhaps more in line with maybe the more popular view amongst folks who maybe aren't decision-making experts, is that this was a bad decision all around? Where are you guys on this?
Dan?
So let me go first. Richard knows much more about football than I do, but I will say that this is a fantastic example of that. Maxim and Annie Duke, who wrote the book Thinking in Bets. If you haven't had her in your podcast, you should definitely do so. Makes the argument that you are advancing in a very compelling way. So with what I know about football, I was convinced by her argumentation about what were the plays available to Carroll and what would have happened. And I think it's a it's a decision that's very rich in thinking probabilistically, because part of the decision hinges on not just everything that was happening, but on what was the probability that the pass would be intercepted at the one, with at the 1 yard line. And you believe, at least the story that Annie Duke was describing, it was infinitely small, and that was the right thing to do. But I'll let Richard, who might have watched this several times. And by the way, Annie is a friend of Richard and former poker champion, and her book Thinking in Bets is fantastic. So I highly recommend it. After you buy Maxims for Thinking Analytically, you should buy Thinking in Bets, or maybe buy the two together. How about that?
First, I want to agree 100% about Annie. She's great. I'm not much of a football fan, but my team was involved, and I'm a fair weather fan. So when the Super Bowl comes along and the Patriots are in it, not something that's happened this last year. I don't think we got to the Super Bowl, but maybe you can correct me.
But you did not. You absolutely did not, Richard. Yeah, no, that's correct.
But I think the correct analysis of this situation is, and I hate to take refuge in complexity, but there's not in these situations where how the Patriots prepare for the play will depend on the probability that you're going to make a certain play. You have to employ a mixed strategy, which means that sometimes you will pass and that sometimes you will run, and they won't know which one you want to do. So the worst thing you can do is to announce to the world, I'm making the best decision. It's clear what that is, and here's what I'm going to do. The thing you should do is you should line up in a way so that the Patriots don't know what's going to happen, and there's some chance you'll play A and some chance you'll play B. Another thing I'm going to say, which is also more complexity, people think when you say you should have a mixed strategy, you should play one thing 50% of the time and the other thing 50% of the time, and that's not true. I mean, depending on what the probabilities are, you should do maybe one thing 73% of the time and the other 27% of the time. So I believe that's what Pete Carroll really did. That doesn't mean that he didn't send in this particular play, but that as he sent in this play, he was considering the Patriots will probably believe that Marshawn Lewis will run. And by the way, even if he doesn't get this run, he'll have another run. Some people are confused. There was 26 seconds left. There was plenty of time for two plays, conceivably on passes, even three plays. And so it was perfectly reasonable to say, hey, we'll try the pass this time. If that doesn't work, we could try Marshawn Lewis, the next time. And I think it's really unfair to say it was a terrible play because it got intercepted, because the probability of an interception was very slim. And certainly Pete Carroll should have said to his quarterback, hey, be sure if you might get intercepted, throw the ball away.
100%.
And I don't think he had to say it at the time, but the quarterback should have been good enough to know that was the principle, which is, frequently the principle.
And to me, this is also a good example of how it is hard for people to accept that you can make a good decision with a bad outcome. Because again, I think if you read most of the headlines in the newspaper, it would be, this was the worst decision ever made. But again, when we talk to folks like yourself, who are actually decision-making experts, you're saying, no, it is entirely possible to make a good decision with a bad outcome. Why do you think it's hard for people to accept that you could make a good decision and end up with a bad outcome? Why do you think that's, a hard concept for anybody, and it's not just this. I think anybody, you guys use a lot of examples in the book where, even somebody taking a job where, they select a job and maybe it doesn't work out. That doesn't necessarily mean that was the wrong decision. It just means that, could just mean that, again, you just made a good decision that unfortunately, maybe perhaps to circumstances outside your control, it just didn't end very well. It doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad decision. Why do you think it's just hard emotionally for people to get around or get through that kind of emotional block of accepting that you can make good decisions with bad outcomes?
Well, I think one of the reasons is that the bad outcome is this is something that two psychologists, Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, who founded the whole field of behavioral decision, talk about the availability heuristic. The idea of there we saw, the Patriots intercepting it. We saw them cheering on the field. We heard, 20 analysts telling us how terrible this was. That was salient in your mind. It's hard for us to envisage the situation where the Seahawks player caught it. We didn't see this. The Seahawks player caught it. They won the Super Bowl. And then we switched to Seattle to see the people celebrating in the streets. So I think a lot of it is you don't see this. I think this is most important, at least in personal decisions, with regard to health.
Absolutely.
And people don't want to take, the doctor sort of says, well, I don't want to do this because this could be the side effect. But I want to know what's the benefit if there is no side effect, or even if there is a side effect, let's save your life. I had a situation that I talk about a lot because it involved my wife, and it was of this sort. 30 years ago, she had a bad case of cancer, and there was a chance that she could get a bone marrow transplant. And the doctor said, well, we don't like to do this because there's a 4% treatment mortality. And that was what they said. And then I sort of said, but what is the gain in survival? And they said, well, we think the gain in survival is somewhere between 10 and 20%. Well, that seemed to me to be a pretty good bet. So my wife and I discussed it, and she went ahead, and, it's 30 years later, and she's alive and playing good tennis. So, it would have been a tragedy if she had died.
Yeah.
But you have to take into account, what the odds are, as you did with the Pika. Now, in that case, we weren't playing against the Seahawks were playing against a malicious opponent. The Patriots were doing everything they could to prevent them from getting a touchdown. When my wife had cancer, I don't believe that nature was conspiring against her. So, our decision was not going to affect, what was going to really happen. We didn't have to fool, Mother Nature in that case. But there are lots and lots of people who don't do things medically because of various side effects. I mean, Dan mentioned that earlier with regard to COVID. The government didn't want to get blamed, for, some adverse things. And by the way, even there, we would have found out about the adverse outcomes probably pretty quickly. But I have people today who won't take various, inoculations and things because they said, well, we don't know what's going to happen 30 years down the road. And that's true. If you today take a shot against shingles, I'm not sure it's been around for 30 years. So it could have some bad effect 30 years down the road. But shingles is a pretty bad thing to have.
Yeah.
And we now think promotes dementia.
The concept you're bringing up, I'm reminded of something else, is this concept of self-driving cars. You'd referenced Elon Musk before, and, Elon Musk, I think, would promote, look, hey, we need to use self-driving cars, because the accident rates in self-driving cars is what he says is actually a lot lower than human beings, is that the rates are a lot lower. However, some of the regulatory, because the automotive industry is highly regulated, some of the regulatory folks, have a hard time accepting the fact that, a robot car could kill somebody. And it's almost more kind of acceptable that that accident happened among human beings, where two humans run their car into each other. That's, if there's a higher proportion of that, that's almost more acceptable than this concept of a self-driving car, where you have a robot or a computer who made the wrong decision, and all of a sudden the car drives off a cliff or something like that. And it's Do you think that's a good parallel between what you're talking about as well?
It is, yes. And it's a new form of risk. And we don't like to accept this new form of risk that a robot car could kill someone. And by the way, there's also this availability. What I remember very early on when a car in Arizona, I think it was probably a Tesla, killed people, and how people were so upset by that and said that we certainly shouldn't allow that. Um, and I'm just amazed. I've, been with people in self-driving cars, how superior they are as you just drive along to, what I do and what Dan does. I mean, if I could right now, just, I'm of a certain age, if I could just easily convert my car to a self-driving car, I would do it, to protect me and to protect the world.
Well, just the impact on traffic alone, like you think about how much traffic slows down due to merging, how much traffic slows down due to, a car accident, let's say on the other side of the road and everybody's watching it. Like again, I've never done the math, but I can just imagine the impact on traffic. Traffic in Toronto is horrendous. I'm sure in Boston, it's probably better. It can't get any worse than Toronto. But the impact just on traffic and flow and everything like that would be dramatically better if we had self-driving cars versus the situation that we're dealing with today. Cause it's not sustainable. There's no more land. You can't build any more roads.
It's also the case that if you had traffic flow with self-driving cars, there'd be many fewer accidents because cars would be, the traffic itself helps to create accidents, where I bump into you, even when you're stopped at a stoplight.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. One of my favorite chapters in the book. If you're somebody out there that listening to all this and saying, look, I don't care about decision-making. I don't care about the book. Decision-making is not my thing. I would still say, read the chapter in the book on living fully, because again, there's a lot of really good advice here. And Dan, maybe I'll flip it over to you first. You have a lot of really good maxims for how to live life to the fullest. Why is it important not to be envious? And again, there's really good examples here about people who were envious at one point in their life, changed up how they think about things, and led to a much happier life when you're not necessarily jealous of, your neighbors or your coworkers or whomever it may be. Give us some perspective on living life and not being envious.
I mean, I think lots of philosophers, religious leaders, and others have written about the drawbacks of being envious. So I'm not sure that I'm going to have something profound to say, but I just want to say that I have observed Richard as a model of this maxim. I remember, I think the first time I heard this maxim from him, he said something like, if Dan is a terrific teacher at the Kennedy School, I'm better off. I don't need to sort of. The world is a very large place, and I'm just fortunate to have someone right next to me that exceeds at something. The same way, I think both Richard and I feel very fortunate to work at a place like the one we work. And we are surrounded by people that if we were to feel envious, we would be envious all the time, because there are so many exceptional people around us.
Especially
And
your
I think
students as
that,
well. The other thing, sorry to interrupt, Dan. The other thing that
yeah,
really struck me about the book is the people that you guys are teaching. Is that you have
yeah,
taught some people who have gone on to do incredible
yeah,
things. And
yeah,
it would be very easy to be envious and say, man, maybe if I wasn't a teacher at Harvard and I actually, followed this person, you'd have more money or you'd have more profile or everything. The people that
yeah,
go through that
yeah,
school are
yeah.
incredible individuals, right?
Yes, and many of them achieve things that are absolutely outstanding. I mean, I'm sure Richard can speak more about this example, but one of Richard's students ended up winning the Nobel Prize in economics.
Wow.
You know, my sense is Richard celebrates this with joy. Other people might sort of say, "Oh, I should have won the Nobel Prize myself," or something like that. I'll say the thing that I don't know about this maxim, like I'm convinced that almost every other maxim in the book, you can work at it and adopt it. This one, I'm a little bit less confident. I don't know. I don't know if this is part of how Richard is built. I would like to think that I'm built in a similar manner. Not that I've never felt envy, but at least in what I do, we have the alumni reunion coming now, and I want to see students, and I know that their success, I'll rejoice in it. I don't think I'll feel envy. I'll feel like, wow, I'm so glad. And in some way, I feel very, very fortunate to be in a profession where the people that I meet every year are people that I wish them well and that I will rejoice in their successes. I don't know how else to say it, but that's where I am with that particular maxim.
And just one last point, one further follow up on there. Do you think in order to think the way you think, is it flipping a switch in terms of saying, look, like I just need to think differently about it? Was there a time in your life where maybe you were envious in your younger years and it's flipping a switch? How do you actually, like you say, I agree with you. I agree with you is that's a difficult thing to teach somebody because again,
Yeah.
you're kind of screwing around with their brain chemistry and getting them to
Yeah.
kind of think and feel in a different way. Is it as easy as flipping a switch or is it more complicated than that?
I I think it might be more complicated than that, because I think even people who are by nature not envious might sometimes experience that feeling, and people who are envious might sometimes not experience that feeling. I think sometimes situations trigger those feelings, but I think reminding yourself that the success of someone close to you is actually good for you, uh, and and that you should rejoice in that. I don't know. I feel like there's um, something that really is very empowering, to wish other people success, to celebrate their successes, to rejoice in their accomplishments. And I don't think it's a switch, but like other maxims in the book, they're meant to be a reminder about it. I want to say about one more maxim in that section. I'm sure Richard is going to have more to say on envy, but this is one that my wife and I still credit as one of the most impactful things that Richard has ever told us, and increased our quality of life quite a bit. Um, it's a maxim that is there's some things you just don't want to know. And the first time I heard this from Richard was when he was describing when his wife Sally would bring like an art piece to their home, and he would ask Sally, "How much did this cost?" And Sally would say, "You don't want to know." And Richard would understand that that meant that he didn't want to know. And to me, um, my wife and I have used that since we heard that story. But to me, the thing that's most impressive about that story is that, as I hope you and your listeners picked up in this conversation, it's hard to meet a person more intellectually curious and engaged and wanting to know stuff than Richard, but yet he has the wisdom to know that sometimes there are things he doesn't want to know, because he knows that he's going to feel bad by knowing those things. So it's in some way it's a beautiful contradiction with a lot of the rest of the book, and the rest, I think, of the spirit of Richard. But one that I want to make sure that your listeners keep in mind. There are really many occasions where you just don't want to know, and you're going to be happier.
Agreed. Richard, you want to give us the last word on envy?
Yeah. So I don't think it's flipping a switch, but I do think you have to have an initial switch in thinking, and then you practice. So the switch in thinking is reading something or listening to this conversation that sort of discusses, why envy is a base emotion, why it doesn't serve you well. So so on and so forth. And then you sort of say, oh, now I understand I should take pride in the fact that Dan is such a terrific teacher. I should take pride in the fact that Dan is such a terrific tennis player. I should take pride in the fact that Dan is just such a terrific person. Okay? And once you recognize that, you also recognize that a lot of envy comes about because I think it's evolution. We were frequently, in small bands, and we were competing with each other for food, for, attracting mates and the like. I've known Dan now decades, and I don't think that we've ever been in serious competition for anything. Okay? If we were both trying to be the dean, maybe, that would explain things. I can tell you that if Dan wanted to be the dean, I would do everything I could to convince him not. And I've already convinced myself not. Okay. So I think the first thing you do is you recognize that envy is not desirable for you. And the next thing you do is you practice it all the time. And occasionally you may slip back, but you get better at it over the years. It's not too dissimilar, I think, from many of the things that I learned. I take tennis lessons all the time. And it's not clear I'm getting better. But you learn things and then you do them right, 90% of the time. And then you take your eye off the ball because we have a deep-seated, desire to watch the opponent and not watch the ball. But if you practice it enough times, you start to be better at watching the ball. I think the same thing is about true with regard to envy. We also make the same point about trying to banish regret from your life. A lot of people don't want to do something because they say, if it works out badly, I'll regret doing it. Well, that's going to prevent you from doing many things. So, I'm therefore perfectly happy. I'm indeed delighted to go to Toronto, even when it might be cold and snowy or wet, because it's such a terrific city. And, if the weather is bad, too bad. And maybe I'll sort of say, geez, next time I'll go in April rather than in March. And that's another thing that you can learn to do. It's not so terrible when you end up in a rainy city or a rainy, cold city.
That's a great way to end on, Richard. If you don't remember anything else from this conversation, if you're listening to this, listen to that because, again, you will live a better life, a happier life, following those maxims than if you didn't. Well, guys, this was a lot of fun. I know you're both extremely busy. Thank you very much for taking the time. We really appreciate you taking the time here on CSI Chat. It was a lot of fun. And I hope we cross paths again. And thank you very much, guys. We really appreciate it.
Thank
you,
you, Scott.
Terrific.
Thank you so much.
Terrific talking with you.
Thank you.
Well, that wraps another episode of CSI Chat, and I really wanted to thank everybody for listening. If you want to keep up to date on CSI Chat, I would encourage everyone to join our CSI Chat LinkedIn group and or follow us on Twitter/X under CSI Chat. With that, I will get you out of here on a high note with some music, and thanks again.
Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our host an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and and go the extra mile. CSI Chat, where the numbers meet the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and go the extra mile. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. Tune in every week for a mix of win facts with a clever accountant who's got your back. We'll laugh and we'll learn and solve the mystery on CSI Chat, where the topic set us free. Tune in every week for a mix of win facts with a clever accountant who's got your back. We'll laugh and we'll learn and solve the mystery on CSI Chat, where the topic set us free. CSI Chat is the podcast you'll adore. With our accountant host, you'll always want more. So grab your headphones and join the fun on CSI Chat, where the mystery's never done. We'll see the case